Well, thanks very much for coming. It's a real pleasure to see you all. And it's a real pleasure for me to be here before my teacher. You know, Ngugi has been a very important figure in my development as a writer. So I'm fortunate to join him and you tonight. I want to give you a flavor of this book. Music is very central to its development. The characters who are here participate in the creation of music, in its dancing, and music also helps break barriers in this story because it's set in colonial Kenya just before independence, just on the cusp of independence. So I want to give you some a sense of the music of the time and its creation. And the main character here is called Rajan. Rajan is the main character in the story. So here it goes. Rajan walked up to the microphone on stage and adjusted it to his height. He was small-bodied, like a stunted teen, with a clutch of jet black hair held at the back by a red, gold and green hairband. When fans saw him for the first time, they often remarked that fame does not match its owner, for his frame came up short of his towering reputation. The instruments were building in tempo. Rajan trembled with delight and nodded appreciatively to the instrumentalists, tapping his right foot, responding to a rhythm that appeared to bubble deep inside him. In his formative years as a singer, Rajan would shake with fright before the curtains opened, unsure how the audience might respond. Sometimes, lines that he had rehearsed for weeks would evaporate at the sight of hundreds of eyes. Now he was a lot more composed, but the dread of performing before a show never really left him. Rajan let the instruments play on. The squeak from the keyboard, the wail of the guitar, and the throb of the drums building into a frenzy. He yanked the microphone from its stand and walked to the edge of the platform as dozens of hands rushed to touch him. He crooned in a low, mournful voice. Baruana kutumia, nikufunze ya dunia, usije ukaangamia, ewe wangwe. Ewe, nawe, uwe wangwe.
Oh, wow.
Thank you.
Hey. So that's Rajan performing at the Jakaranda Hotel.
Right.
And is that the night he meets the woman?
Yeah, that's just before he encounters the woman.
The mysterious woman in the dark.
The mysterious woman in the dark.
Who he kisses.
Yes.
And that begins the whole saga.
Right, right. Yeah, so that was a moment when he's actually just about to encounter this loss that's quite monumental to his own development as a young man, and the story is unraveling.
Peter, it struck me that Ngugi writes about finding his voice and wanting to tell a collective tale about Kenya, collective dreams for freedom, for land, for education. And it struck me that your book also has this idea of a collective vision of Kenya, right. A big tapestry of different multi-ethnic, the Africans, the Indians, the British. Mm-hmm. So tell me why you were inspired to write such a big portrait.
Right.
Of Kenya.
Yeah, sure. One of the things, earlier today when we were talking, and I looked through the play, The Black Hermit, yes, which is Mwalimu Ngugi's first published work, I believe. There's a preface that he outlined some of the social challenges that the country faced.
Yeah.
And it was so interesting that those same issues persist to this date. So questions about the desire to form a state, the making of a nation where you have disparate communities that are still not at loggerheads, but there is evidence of people exploiting their differences as opposed to utilizing that as a force that's positive. So my own desire to look at a community in my country that has been always outside our equation. We don't even remember them. I thought it is an opportunity for me to make a commentary about the larger challenges that we face as a nation. So there, in other words, to answer your question, there are continuities in the issues that they were articulating in the 60s that are still as valid and immediate in this century.
You decided to go back in history to trace them from the early 1900s.
Right,
when
right.
the railroad was being built.
Right. And I think my motivation was to understand where did the rain start beating us. And I think the foundation informs quite a lot. Because the larger motivation for me is to question the colonial history that has informed our narrative to the world.
And what you were saying, that it's interesting that you're one of the few African writers that focuses as well on the Indian community that was brought in to work as engineers on the railroad.
Yeah. And again, there are a number of reasons for my interest. One of them being it is really the train or the construction of the railway that opened the country for exploitation, for colonial occupation. So the train also becomes a metaphor because it is compartmentalized. So you have first class, second class, and third class, and each race, each assigned to different races. So it became almost the experiment that becomes the foundation of the colony, because the country was finally divided along similar lines. So you had the White Highlands, the most productive areas in central Kenya, some parts of the Rift Valley that became, the White Highlands. You had, establishments for black people. You had for Indians and for Arabs. So the railroad is the avenue through which the Brits come and conquer the land. And then they use that same design of the train and the coaches to divide the country. Yeah. So my interest in the Indians, especially, was they represented the silent majority. Well, that's a political statement in this country, but there is a feeling that we had neglected recognizing their contribution, whether negative or positive. My work as a writer was to bring attention to their being.
And we find out Rajan's grandfather, Babu, was one of the Indians who was brought to work on the railroad. And then we later find out, decades later, he becomes politicized and actively supports the underground movement for independence in Kenya.
Right. So Babu actually is a very important figure in the struggle. And there was some Indian, looking through history. I could read some individuals like Makan Singh, who was a trade unionist, and he's involved very actively in the movement, but the independence government does not recognize his place or his role in the struggle. So it was tribute to some of those important people who made a contribution to the creation of the country.
I believe this novel was started at Iowa, right, at the Iowa program.
Right. Yeah, so I went to Iowa in 2007, and so it's a huge program. They bring about 30 writers from all over the world, and then I start writing my story, the Jakaranda. But that was in November 2007. So in December, when I went to Kenya, there was a political crisis. We had elections and they were disputed. The outcome was disputed. Like you nearly had a disputed election in this country. But thankfully, you didn't go to war or you didn't go to fight each other. Well, some people did go to the streets actually. so so you are reenacting the Kenyan script 10 years later. So as a writer, you need the peace of mind, really. You cannot be able to create if your very survival is in jeopardy. So I wasn't able to write this story for the next 4 years. So I kept my draft away, but I wrote for children. I was commissioned by Oxford University Press in Nairobi to write a children's novel looking at the political crisis from the perspective of a child. And I think that's what I wanted personally, to understand, where, as I said, where the rain started beating us. So I'm usually intrigued by the foundation of the country because you have these disruptions that seems to be, we are so fragile at some point. So I wasn't able to return to this story for 4 years until I went to Houston to pursue my creative writing program. So although I started in 2007, for half the time I wasn't even writing it because I didn't have the stability in my own space to be able to create.
And what about when you return to Nairobi? What is writing life there like now? You said before that for Ngugi's generation, a lot of writers who you looked up to left in the 80s and 90s and were in exile, and they left a vacuum in the literary world in Kenya.
Right. Yeah. Just for the benefit of our audience here, we had political repression between late 70s to the early 90s, nearly 20 years of repression. And this was enhanced by Cold War politics. So if politicians who were in power were propped by powers either in the East or the West, the people were left really at a loss. So what happened is that a majority of African writers who are ahead of us, Mwalimu Ngugi is one of them. You had Achebe, who was in the US, Shoyinka was in the US. A majority of writers of that generation were away from the continent. That hasn't been always acknowledged, but it was a huge loss for young writers who had no role models. They had no people to look up to. They know they are there, but they cannot hear their voice. They cannot go to their readings. They cannot go to a lecture where they are participating. So, as I said, we were corresponding with Mwalimu by mail. And when I got my first novel published, I mailed a copy to him in California, thanking him for his contribution to my making as a writer, although he didn't know me personally. So it was a huge challenge to nurture a literary tradition without the writers being physically present in the continent.
Do you want to do a short read?
Sure. Because a train is quite central to this story, I want to give you a small inkling of what it feels to be on that train or to be watching it. This after the railroad had been constructed. When the whistle of the train heading westward blasts every Tuesday at 6:15 a.m. and rents the air again on Thursday evening at 5:35 p.m. to announce that the iron beast is slithering through the land towards the ocean where it all started, it is always a source of merriment for the locals. They will narrate how they went, how the week went, and how the train intersected with their lives. I was having my second cup of tea when the train to Mombasa passed. A girl will tell her lover to illustrate the length of time she was waiting at the coffee shop. I knew I was late for work because the horn of the train sounded while I was still in bed. A worker will confess to a colleague. Hotel check-in time is organized around the train arrival in the township when tourists come by the thousands. They are met at the train station by tour guides ready to retell a well-worn yarn. They will point towards the imposing Jakaranda Hotel, whose replica was restored soon after independence at an enormous cost to the independent government. Experts were flown in from London to ensure it was an authentic production of the house that Ian Edward MacDonald had built in 1901. Tour guides will point to the various aspects of the establishment and announce proudly, "That's the place that heralded the birth of this town." Thank you.
Thank you.
You've both spoken about the social and political stakes of literature. What advice do you have for American writers in today's political climate? How do your experiences translate to this context, post-Trump's election?
In the present context.
Well, I was trying to, I didn't hear very clearly, but if you're speaking to writers responding to the social environment that they're operating in, was that the larger question?
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
And
Well,
correct me if I'm wrong, she said at the end, post-Trump's election? Yeah.
Oh,
well, you'll have a very interesting situation because this is one moment when fact and fiction can actually exist together. So it's a very fertile time for writers to write and document your history as seen from this fictional and non-fictional space. But I think, it's interesting you speak to that because that's one of the notions I'm challenging in my own story, that what we've read as our history could be fictional because there is quite a bit of fraud that's happening in our situation. I think writers, if you're committed to your own society, you cannot seek to write about the universe. That's being today they discovered seven new
oh yeah, that was
new places where we can inhabit. But in 40 years, 41 years,
light years.
40 light years. So. That's also a very powerful story to tell. But I think the more immediate social issues and the disruption of society as we know it is a powerful moment for writers to write. So I can only encourage you to do that.